In April of 1819, the residents of Georgetown, South Carolina had a big event to prepare for. They were welcoming the President of the United States. President James Monroe, the fifth president of our young nation, had determined that he would take an extended tour of the South, and South Carolina's third oldest city was a definite stop on his journey. President Monroe was a Revolutionary War hero, and at the time of his 1817 inauguration, America was enjoying a swell of optimism after its victory in the War of 1812. In fact, because the White House had been badly burned by the British in the war, Monroe decided to travel the northern states on a goodwill tour while it was being repaired. The trip took 15 weeks, and Monroe so impressed Americans with his relaxed and affable personality, the tour, and later the Monroe presidency, were often referred to as the era of good feelings. Monroe also found success on the diplomatic front. He carefully crafted agreements with England that fostered further peace. He dealt cordially with Spain, even as the foreign power encouraged uprisings of the Seminole Indians of Florida. In 1819, Spain signed the Florida Purchase Treaty, which gave the Florida Territory to the United States in return for the forgiveness of $5 million in debt. And President Monroe welcomed the new states of Mississippi, Illinois, and Alabama into the Union. Then things got complicated. Missouri applied for statehood in 1818. Shortly after, New York Republican Congressman James Talmadge Jr. proposed that Missouri abolish slavery as a condition to admission as a state. With 11 slave states and 11 free states in the Union, Southern slaveholding states were furious that the federal government might limit their voting power in Congress. When President Monroe visited Georgetown, the debate over slavery and the rights of states to choose their own path was raging. President Monroe was also wrestling with the effects of the Panic of 1819. The American economy had been growing since the end of the War of 1812, but expansion had slowed. Real estate values plummeted, and banks stopped giving loans. People were forced out of their homes and off their farms. Then in March of 1819, just before President Monroe's southern tour, the price of cotton collapsed on the European market. Georgetown was less affected by the economic slump than some areas. Rice, the area's largest crop, was in high demand domestically and worldwide. Plantations with thousands of acres of rice fields dominated the landscape. Of course, this meant the question of slavery was very important to Georgetown planters. Their livelihood depended on it. Over 3/4 of the local population was enslaved. When President Monroe arrived in Georgetown County on April 21, 1819, he was met by a contingent of well-wishers from the All Saints Parish, who escorted him to Prospect Hill Plantation. The plantation was owned by Mary Alston UG and her second husband Benjamin UG, who served in the United States Congress from 1799 to 1805 and again from 1815 to 1817.
President James Monroe came to South Carolina and was here at this house at Prospect Hill Plantation on part of modern-day Arcadia. President Monroe's entourage as he arrived here at Prospect Hill included his U.S. Secretary of War and South Carolina native John C. Calhoun, as well as Major General Thomas Pinckney, the son of Eliza Lucas, who created the first empire in indigo cultivation before rice cultivation transformed all of Georgetown County. As the entourage arrived by boat at Prospect Hill, they were greeted by a great red carpet rolled out from the landing all the way to the house. It's interesting to hear the description at the time that they were received and entertained with all the attention and respect due President Monroe's high office and amiable private character, and with the usual South Carolina hospitality. Here at this house, Prospect Hill, constructed by 1794 by Thomas Alston, his wife Mary, and an enslaved laborer, a carpenter named Dick, this house stands as the keystone for 7 plantations today that make up the Vanderbilt property called Arcadia. President Monroe undoubtedly enjoyed the grand gardens that Mrs. Mary Alston UG had laid out. Just north of the house, the gardens laid out in the shape of an H, obviously for UG, H-U-G-E-R, an old French Huguenot name from South Carolina. Also, the camellias in April would still be apparent on the large shrubs here, as well as beautiful azaleas, first brought to America and planted in Charleston, South Carolina, before coming up to Georgetown County and the Waccamaw Neck.
At 11 the next morning, President Monroe boarded an elegant New York barge donated by a neighbor, Colonel Alston. The barge was decorated with patriotic colors and accompanied by a whole flotilla of boats. When the barge made its appearance at the entrance to the Sandpit River, a federal salute was fired from field pieces manned by volunteer citizens. The president was met by crowds waving flags as he landed at the market wharf and was greeted by the intendant, Robert Harriet, and the town council. The crowd then formed a procession, and everyone walked to a house prepared for the president and his party.
When President Monroe came through Georgetown 200 years ago and met with some of the locals here in Georgetown, they probably walked right over here to the Thomas Bolam house, where Captain Bolam ran a tavern. The house was built in 1734, 85 years before President Monroe visited here, and he probably stopped at that time and had a tankard of ale.
Benjamin UG then delivered a welcoming address, reminding the crowd that Monroe was the first president to visit since founding Father George Washington, who had traveled the same path 20 years earlier. President Monroe replied to the address with the charm that marked his presidency.
Sir, I should be destitute of feeling if I was not deeply affected by the very kind reception and generous sentiments expressed of my conduct in the service of my country by the citizens of Georgetown and of the adjacent country on my arrival among them.
Monroe and a large crowd of town fathers and citizens then enjoyed a festive dinner at which 22 toasts were given. A copy of the Winyah Intelligencer, Georgetown's newspaper in 1819, listed each toast, which included accolades to the federal Constitution, the Union, the memory of George Washington, and all the living ex-presidents. The next day, President Monroe toured Winyah Bay, the entrance to the port, and its adjoining shores and waters. In 1819, the harbor would have been dotted with small boats visiting from the plantations. Monroe may have seen Georgetown's pilot boat guiding commercial ships in from the ocean, or one of the early steamboats that traveled between Georgetown and Charleston. The president returned for a late dinner and slept in Georgetown another night. The next morning, Monroe and another festive flotilla of boats set out for El Dorado, the plantation home of his friend, Major General Thomas Pinckney. The town fathers accompanied the president to the South Santee River, then sailed home to the gratified citizenry of Georgetown.